Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive? This time, we're going to be looking at how AI is changing the world of software development.
Yeah, and what's so cool is we're not talking about some far-off future here. We're diving into a brand new research paper that looks at three major companies,
Oh, wow.
Microsoft, Accenture, and this big electronics company that's staying anonymous for now. And they've all been trying out AI coding assistants in their day-to-day work.
So you're talking about those tools like, was it GitHub Copilot?
Exactly.
The one that's kind of like having a super smart coding buddy, like right there making
Yeah,
suggestions,
like a coding buddy.
helping with documentation, all that stuff.
Exactly. And what's really neat about this research is that it involved like thousands of developers working on actual projects
Wow.
for months. Some had Copilot, some didn't, and they tracked their progress. It wasn't just a lab test, it was real-world data.
Oh, that's correct.
Makes the results so much more impactful.
Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. What did they find? Did using these AI tools like turn everyone into a coding superstar overnight?
Well, the headline is that developers using Copilot were able to complete about 26% more tasks each week.
26%.
Wow.
But like any research, there's always some nuance. The standard error was 10.3%,
Okay.
which means there's a range around that number.
The
Measuring productivity is complex, so a single number doesn't tell the whole story.
Okay, I got it. But even with that in mind, 26% is still pretty darn impressive. Can you give us some concrete examples of what those tasks might be?
Absolutely. So they looked at things like pull requests, which is basically when a developer makes a bunch of code changes and they need to get them reviewed
Great.
and approved. They also tracked the number of commits, which are individual updates to the code. How often developers successfully compile their code, which is like putting all the pieces together so it actually runs.
Gotcha. So this AI is helping developers do all that essential stuff faster,
Yep.
which means more work gets done.
Right.
That makes sense. But I'm guessing it wasn't like a one-size-fits-all situation. You're right. It's actually really interesting how the AI didn't have the same impact on everyone. Less experienced developers actually saw much bigger gains than their more senior colleagues.
Oh, really?
Yeah, even after taking into account how long they'd been coding, newer developers got a bigger boost from Copilot.
That's interesting. I wonder if it's because they're still kind of learning the ropes and the AI can help fill in some gaps.
Yeah, maybe.
Or maybe it kind of levels the playing field a little bit.
Yeah.
Gives them a tool that lets them keep up with more seasoned developers. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it kind of points to this larger question of how AI might change the workforce in general.
Well, yeah.
Will it create new inequalities or help those who might otherwise fall behind?
Right.
Lots of unknowns. It's definitely something to keep an eye on as these tools become more common.
Okay, hold on to that thought for a second because there's another twist that I found really interesting. The paper also mentioned that some experienced developers actually stopped using Copilot after giving it a try. What's up with that? Did they just not like it, or is there something else going on?
You know, it seems that even in the tech world, people can be resistant to change.
Oh, for sure.
Some of those experienced developers might have tried Copilot and decided it wasn't for them and just went back to their old ways.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me of when we all had to learn new phones or operating systems.
Right.
It takes time to get used to new tools, especially when you already have a system that works for you. Speaking of getting used to things, though, the paper actually had some pretty surprising details about how people adopted Copilot in these companies.
Yeah. At Microsoft, for example, the initial adoption rate was shockingly low. Only about 8.5% of developers signed up for it at first.
Really? Only 8%. I mean,
Mhm.
I guess even when something is free and potentially awesome, it's not a guaranteed hit.
Right.
It's kind of interesting that they actually needed multiple email reminders to get people on board.
Yeah. And on top of that, about 30–40% of developers across all three companies never even tried Copilot, even though they had access.
Wow, that's a pretty big chunk of people.
Right.
What does that tell us about how people adopt new tech?
I think it suggests that simply giving someone access to a tool isn't enough. There's got to be more.
Yeah.
The user experience has to be clear demonstrations of how it adds value. Maybe even some guidance on how to best integrate it into their workflow.
That's such a good point. Even in the age of AI, human behavior and psychology are still huge factors in whether a technology really takes off. So we've got this really interesting picture of how these AI coding assistants are being used out in the real world. We see a significant boost in productivity, especially for newer developers. But we also see that adoption isn't automatic and experienced developers.
Mm,
They might have their own reasons for sticking with what they know.
exactly. And there's still so much more to unpack, like the
Yeah.
impact on code quality and, the long-term implications of all this.
Absolutely. We'll delve into those fascinating questions right after.
Or quick break.
Oh, yeah, we got to take a quick break. Stay tuned because things are about to get even more interesting.
So before we were talking about how some people just aren't quite ready to jump into using AI tools.
Yeah. And you know what else I'm curious about?
What's that?
We've talked about AI boosting productivity,
Right.
but does that mean it's actually making the code better?
Yeah.
Or are we just getting more code? And maybe some of it isn't so great.
Right. That's the question everyone wants to know, right?
Yeah,
Speed is great, but if the code is full of errors,
exactly.
it can actually really slow things down in the long run.
Totally. You don't want to be creating more problems just to get things done faster.
Yeah.
So what did the researchers have to say about that? Did they look into code quality at all?
They did, and it's actually pretty interesting. They measured code quality by looking at something called the build success rate,
Okay.
which is basically how often the code compiled without any errors.
Got it.
And get this, they found no drop in code quality among the developers who were using Copilot.
Wait, so the AI wasn't spitting out a bunch of buggy code? Does that mean it can actually write good code all by itself? That's kind of mind-blowing.
That's the big question, isn't it? It's possible the AI is writing good code, but it's also possible that the human developers are just really good at catching and fixing any errors that the AI might make.
Right.
This is where that human oversight comes in. It's still so important even as these AI tools get more and more advanced.
It makes you wonder what the ideal balance is going forward, right? Like, are we heading towards a world where AI handles all the tedious and repetitive tasks,
Yeah.
and then humans just focus on the bigger picture stuff like design and really tricky debugging?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. And remember, the study only looked at the initial adoption phase.
Right.
What happens over the long term? Do the productivity gains keep going, or do people eventually hit a ceiling?
And will using AI actually change how people code? Not just how fast they do it.
Right.
Like if you're constantly relying on an AI to suggest solutions, does that change the way you approach problems?
Exactly. All great questions. These are all questions that future research is going to need to explore.
Yeah.
But even these early findings bring up some really important points.
For sure. If AI is already changing how we work, what skills are going to be the most valuable in the future? Is it going to be all about technical expertise? Or will things like being able to collaborate with AI effectively become just as important?
I think it's going to be a combination of both. We're going to need people who really understand the technical side of things,
Right.
but also people who can look at what the AI is suggesting and be able to think about it critically,
Yeah.
understand its limitations and make sure it's being used to really get the best possible results. It's about augmenting human intelligence, not replacing it.
Well said.
Yeah.
This whole conversation has been so thought-provoking, and I bet our listeners are feeling the same way. We've seen how AI can really amp up coding productivity, but it's not a simple story. It's not the same for everyone, and it raises way more questions than it answers.
Yeah, it's true. It really is a fascinating time to be watching all of this unfold. And as we go forward, it's just so crucial that we keep asking these questions. We need to understand the nuances of this technology
Right.
and make sure it's being used responsibly and ethically.
Well said.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so on that note, I think we're ready to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. If AI is already changing the game for developers like this, it kind of makes you wonder what it means for everyone else you know.
It really does. It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, no matter what field we're in.
Right.
What will your job look like in 5 years, 10 years? How can we start preparing now for a future where AI is just a normal part of the workplace?
This deep dive has really highlighted how important it is to be adaptable and to keep learning new things.
Yeah.
And maybe we even need to develop a partnership mindset when it comes to AI.
Absolutely. It's not just about learning technical skills anymore. It's about nurturing those uniquely human qualities that AI just can't replicate.
Yeah, like what?
Things like critical thinking, creativity, empathy, and being able to connect the dots and see the big picture.
Because at the end of the day, AI is a tool.
Right.
And like any tool, it's only as effective as the person who's using it. It's
Yeah.
not about AI replacing us.
Right.
It's about figuring out how we can use AI to enhance our own abilities and create something even better.
Well said. That's something for all of us to think about as we navigate this exciting but rapidly changing world.
Totally. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of AI and software development. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah, it's been great exploring these ideas with you.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh,
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.